All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's 10:01, so I thought I would just come on here and welcome you. My name is Jason Sleed. I am the Communications Director here at Revenue, and I had invited everybody to this presentation today, and we really appreciate you taking the time out of your Friday morning to do this, and we're really excited to share this information with you. Just a couple of housekeeping things. There is a chat function. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll have a bottom rail of your Zoom client. And there is a button that says chat. That's a really good way for you to interact with us and ask us questions. We can get those questions answered at the best we can. Also, our presentation today has a couple different presenters, and we'll try to answer any question and answer sections after we have the presentation today. But then that way we can allow for back and forth in live time. Also, like I've been saying, this is a recorded event. So if you happen to have to excuse yourself, that's okay. This will be recorded. It will take us about 24 hours to post it, though. So it might be Monday until you can see the recorded version again. But outside of that, if you have any questions, you can sure reach out to me, and otherwise we can get this going. Right now, I'd like to introduce Director Brendan Beatty. He is our Director of Department of Revenue.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for attending our public series on the implementation of House Bills 231 and 542 from the last legislative session. As Jason said, my name is Brendan Beatty. I'm the Director of the Department of Revenue. Many of you know me from our now better than 4 years of interaction. I'm not going to waste your time. I am going to introduce you to many of you to two of the best I have ever served with in state government at the Department of Revenue and anywhere else. Eric Dale, our Director of Tax Policy and Research, and Bryce Kotz from our Property Assessment Division are the two people in the state of Montana who know more about this legislation and how it will be implemented than the rest of us combined. They have done so much work on this, so much analysis, and they were instrumental in making this thing so maybe it'll actually even get done, that you can't even imagine the effort they've put in. I'm going to introduce them to walk you through how these bills or this bill is going to be implemented. They will have answers to your questions, and I'm going to excuse myself and go to my next meeting. Thank you all for attending, and please, as always, we work for the taxpayers. We work for you. If you ever have questions, call any of us. Feel free to contact us at any time so we can help you out. Thanks for attending, and I hope you enjoy the presentation.
All right, well, thank you, Brendan. Let me just work on sharing my screen here real quick.
Thank you, everybody, for your patience. And go ahead.
All right, if you want to go to the next slide. So again, Eric Dale with the Montana Department of Revenue Tax Policy and Research Unit. I'm going to talk about some of the changes from this last session, specifically House Bill 231 and Senate Bill 542, and some of the changes that those two pieces of legislation made. So before we get started, I thought it'd be a good idea to kind of get everybody on the same page as, and how property taxes work and that sort of thing. Probably old hat for a lot of people in this meeting, but probably good to be on the same page. So if we think about property taxes, ultimately property taxes are determined by taking the taxable value, multiplying it by the consolidated mill amounts, and then dividing it by 1,000. If you were like a lot of Montanans out there and taxpayers out there, you might not be familiar with this taxable value term. So if you want to click the next slide, Jason. The taxable value is defined as the market value times the tax rate. And this is important because a lot of times you'll hear conversations surrounding property taxes as property taxes are a function of three different entities. And those entities are generally the Montana Department of Revenue, the state legislature, and the local taxing jurisdiction. So the Montana Department of Revenue is responsible for determining the market value, those tax rates that determine what portion of that market value is subject to the mills is determined in statute, which is ultimately the purview of the Montana State Legislature. And then the mills are ultimately a function of the local taxing jurisdictions. So if you want to hit the next button there, the tax rate is, as I said, primarily the purview of the Montana legislature, and that's where a lot of the changes with Senate Bill 542 and House Bill 231 were made. So that'll be primarily what we talk about today. And just to reiterate, the changes in taxable value are not necessarily the change in taxes at this point, because as I'm sure a lot of you are well aware, the mills have yet to be set at this point. So we'll just be talking about taxable value, but that's kind of what we're talking about. So as we go forward, we'll start with some of the simpler changes that were made this last legislature. So one of the changes I wanted to bring to your attention is the tax rate for agricultural land. So prior to this legislation, the standard tax rate for agricultural land, or class 3 property as we refer to it here in the department, was 2.16%. So that means that 2.16% of the productivity value of that land is equal to the taxable value of that property. And again, agricultural land is valued based on the productivity of that land as opposed to the market value of some other types of properties. But in addition to the sort of standard rate for class 3 agricultural land, we also have this classification of non-qualified agricultural land. And that is defined as anything over 20 acres but under 160 acres, and those properties are also valued using the productivity capacity of the land. However, the tax rate for those properties is statutorily defined as 7 times the standard class 3 rate. So in 2024, 7 times 2.16 was 15.12. However, as I said, Senate Bill 542 and House Bill 231 made several changes. If you want to hit the next slide, you can see those changes. So here are the new rates for class 3 property. So the new standard rate is going to be 2.05%. So that means the taxable value for typical agricultural property is going to be equal to 2.05 times the productive value. As I said, since the non-qualified agricultural land tax rate is statutorily defined as 7 times that standard rate, now that new rate will be 7 times 2.05% or 14.35%. So those are some of the changes that they made to agricultural land as a result of those two bills passing. But in addition to that, there were also changes to residential property tax rates. So in 2024, the standard rate for a vast majority of residential property was equal to 1.35%. So that means that the taxable value was equal to 1.35% times the market value of the property in 2024. In addition to that, there was also this kind of additional wrinkle of single family dwellings over $1.5 million had a tax rate of 1.89%. It's important to remember that that is only for the improvement portion of the property. So the land underneath that single family dwelling continues to receive that 1.35% rate. And then in addition, any property with multiple single family dwellings also gets that 1.5 million cap for each single family dwelling. So if you think about an example of a high-end property with like a guest home or something of that nature, each of those would receive the first 1.5 million tax rate at 1.35%. In any event, there were several changes in tax year 2025. So with Senate Bill 542 and House Bill 231 passing, that changed that sort of 1.35 standard rate to a more tiered structure. And so now those are going to be tiered rates based on the entire value of the property. And specifically, the first $400,000 in value is going to be taxed at 0.76%. The market value between 400,000 and 1.5 million will now be taxed at 1.1%. And any market value over 1.5 million will be taxed at 2.2%. And that's going to apply to all residential property, regardless of use. And then in 2026, there were some additional changes that were made. One of the ones you might notice is there was an additional tier added, and then as opposed to defining those threshold amounts, they were actually set to be a function of the median value. So up to the median value is now taxed at 0.76%. Any market value over the median value, but less than 2 times the median value will now get a 0.9% rate. And then any market value over 2 times the median, but less than 4 times the median will get a 1.1% tax rate. And then any market value over 4 times the median value will get that 1.9% tax rate. Since we are on a 2-year cycle, we have some preliminary estimates of what those median values are going to be. Hit the next slide. So we're initially anticipating those median value for residential property is going to be 378,000. So that means the first 378,000 in market value will be taxed at 0.76%. Market value between 378,000 and 756,000 will now be taxed at 0.9%. The market value over 756,000 but less than 1.512 million will be taxed at 1.1%, and then any market value over 1.512 will be taxed at 1.9%. Now, it's important to remember that in 2025, those tiered rates apply to all residential properties. However, in 2026, these tiered rates will only be available to primary residence and long-term rentals. For most properties, if they do not fall into those categories, they will be subject to that 1.9% for the entire market value of the property. So that's going to include things like second homes, vacation homes, short-term rentals, vacant land, and basically things that are not classified as primary residence or short-term rentals. Additionally, just so that you're aware, there's also going to be a special rate for properties that don't qualify as a primary residence but are on agricultural land, and that rate will be equal to 1.35. So for example, if a family farm is organized as an LLC and owns the property, they wouldn't necessarily qualify as a primary residence, but they still may qualify for that 1.35% rate. And then in addition, there's additional rates for some multifamily dwellings that might have several dwellings and might have a large market value, so they're not necessarily getting charged that full 1.9% rate. So this is just something to be aware of. If you want to go to the next slide, Jason. So in addition to thinking about those tables that we just talked about, it might be helpful to think about sort of what those numbers in those tables actually mean. So here we're going to graph the taxable value as a function of the market value. So the taxable value is on the vertical axis, and then it shows the market value on the horizontal axis. As you can see, here's the tax rates or the taxable value calculations, what they would have been in 2025 without the passage of Senate Bill 542 and House Bill 231. So you can see that's a straight line there. And that makes sense because the slope of that line is going to be equal to 1.35%. And then if we think about what the implications of Senate Bill 542 and House Bill 231 are, you can see that dotted line down there at the bottom is for the first $400,000. So that has a tax rate of 0.76. And then as we go from $400,000 to $1.5 million, the new tax rate for that portion of the market value is going to be equal to 1.1%. So again, you can see the slope of that line is greater than the first portion, but it's still less than that solid black line because 1.1 is less than 1.35. And then as you go from 1.5 million onward, the market value will then be taxed at 2.2%. So you can see the slope of that line starts to increase and eventually crosses the solid black line. And what that means is that properties at the high end, so above approximately $2.1 million, will actually have a higher taxable value under Senate Bill 542 and House Bill 231 than they would have in absence of those legislation. Those two bills. And I think another thing to notice about this is I think some of the intent of this legislation was to help provide relief for some of the more modestly valued homes and to help offset that reduction in taxable value with less of a reduction or even an increase in taxable value for some of the higher value homes. And that's kind of what you kind of see here. If we jump to 2025, the following year, it's a very similar story. So again, that solid black line is just that 1.35%, or what it would have been in absence of the passage of Senate Bill 542 and House Bill 231. But now the first $378,000 is going to be taxed at that 0.76%. And then anything over 378,000 up to 756,000 will be taxed at that 0.9% rate, which again is less than the 1.35. And then market values between 756,000 and 1.512 million will be subject to that 1.1% rate, and then anything over 1.512 million will now be subject to that higher 1.9% rate. So again, it's very similar to what it looked like in tax year 2025, although with the top rate now being 1.9 as opposed to 1.2, you can see those two lines don't cross now until approximately 2.5, 2.6 million or so, meaning properties above that market value are going to see a higher taxable value than they would have without those two bills passing. As I mentioned, that's only true if those properties are primary residence or long-term rentals. If those properties are not in that category, so if they're short-term rentals or vacation homes, for example, then they would be subject to that 1.9% rate. And here you can see that with that red dotted line. Again, you'll notice the slope of that line is much greater, meaning that the taxable values will be a lot higher than they would have otherwise been. Again, with the idea of trying to provide as much benefit as possible to the lower market value homes, and trying to offset that by increased taxable value on the higher market value homes and those long-term rentals short-term rentals and vacation homes. This is kind of the idea in tax year 2026. In addition to looking at what the taxable value would be, it also might be helpful to look at what the effective tax rate for the entire property is based on its market value, or the average tax rate basically for the property. So here we see, again, without these two pieces of legislation passing, the effective tax rate would have been 1.35%. And that's true pretty much regardless of the market value. Again, if you think about a $300,000 property, or excuse me, $3 million property, and if you assume that half of the value is attributable to the land and the other half is attributable to the improvements, then all of that property is going to be taxed at 1.35%. But as I said, that's going away. So here in 2025, again, that first $400,000 will be subject to that 0.76% rate. And then from $400,000 to 1.5 million will be subject to that higher 1.1% rate. But it's important to remember that even though any additional market value for those properties will be subject to that higher rate, they're still benefiting from the first $400,000 being subject to that lower rate. And so because of that, the average rate for the entire property slowly increases as you get greater and greater market values, because that first $400,000 represents a smaller and smaller share of the overall market value of the property. And then at 1.5 million, you see there's another sort of kink in that line as the additional market value becomes subject to that 2.2% tax rate. And again, you can kind of see that those two lines cross at approximately $2.1 million, meaning that property above that threshold would have a higher taxable value than they would have in absence of this legislation. So that's tax year 2025. Next, we want to look at tax year 2026, and it's a very similar looking picture. So again, the solid black line is 1.35% there. And then now the first $378,000 is subject to that 0.76% rate. Then the market value above 378 but less than 756,000 is subject to 0.9%. The market value between 756 and 1.512 million is now subject to 1.1%, and then any value over 1.512 million is now subject to that higher 1.9% rate. And again, you can see that that sort of effective tax rate is increasing as the market value increases. But now, because of that lower 1.9% being the top rate, those two lines don't cross until about 2.5 or 2.6 million dollars. As I mentioned before, that is only for primary residence and long-term rentals. So if the property is not in those two categories, then they are subject to that higher 1.9% rate. All right, now let's look at a couple examples real quick. So we'll look at three examples. So the first one is a $350,000 home. The second example is a $750,000 home, and the final property is a $2 million home. So the taxable value without this legislation would have simply been 1.35% times that market value. So the first house has a taxable value of $4,725. The second one has a taxable value of $10,125, and the final property has a $27,000 taxable value. And now if we look at what those taxable values will be in tax year 2025 with Senate Bill 542 and House Bill 231, you can see that first property is subject to that 0.76% rate, and all of it is subject to that rate because it is under that $400,000 threshold. If we look, that's a decrease of approximately $2,000 relative to what it would have been in absence of those legislations, and in percentage terms, that's a reduction in taxable value of 43.7%. The second home has a taxable value of $6,890, which is an overall effective tax rate of 9.19%. Again, because that first $400,000 is taxed at 0.76%, and then the amount over $400,000 is taxed at that second tier, or 1.1%. So the average rate is 9.19%. The reduction in taxable value, you'll notice 3,235. So it's a greater reduction in taxable value relative to the first home. But then if you look at the percentage reduction, you'll notice that the percentage reduction of the second home is only a 32% reduction relative to what it would have been, whereas the first lower valued home has a 43.7% reduction. And then finally, if we look at the $2 million home, we can see that the average rate there is 1.307. And that is a mere $860 reduction because, again, some of that is subject to that higher 2.2% rate. But it is still a reduction. Namely, it's a 3.9% reduction, so a lot smaller in percentage terms relative to the first two properties. So that's tax year 2025. Next, if we do tax year 2026, again, it looks very similar. That first property has the same taxable value because, again, all of it's going to be subject to that 0.76% tax rate. And again, you can see that with the effective tax rate right there. That's a 43.7% reduction. However, now the second home also benefits from that second tier. Anything above 378,000 now is taxed at 0.9% as opposed to 0.1. So the taxable value for that property is going to be $6,221 in tax year 26, which is less than it is in 2025, and $3,904 less than it would have been without those two pieces of legislation. In percentage terms, that represents a 38.56% reduction relative to what it would have been. And then finally, if we look at that $2 million property, we can see the taxable value now is $23,863. The effective rate is 1.193%. So again, they are also benefiting not only from the additional tiers, but also the lower top rate. So the reduction in value or taxable value relative to what it would have been is now 11.62%, as opposed to 3.19%. In dollar terms, it's a $3,000 reduction. And again, to reiterate, that only applies if those properties are long-term rentals or primary residence. If they are second homes or short-term rentals, then they would be subject to a 1.9% tax rate. And so there's those taxable values for those three properties. And you can see that those taxable values are actually greater than what they would have been in absence of those two pieces of legislation. And the other thing to notice is that because all of the property is subject to that 1.9% rate, the percentage increase in taxable value is also constant for all three properties at 40.74% of an increase. That was residential property. Next, we'll move on to commercial property, as there were a few changes there as well. So in 2024, in absence of this legislation, the standard tax rate for commercial property, class 4 commercial property, was 1.89%. Then starting in 2025, we're going to introduce a tiered rate, only 2 tiers for the commercial property as opposed to the 3 tiers for the residential properties. But the first $400,000 now will be taxed at 1.4%, and then any market value over $400,000 will be taxed at 1.89%. So it's the same rate as it was in 2024. And then again, in 2026, we're going to change that to be a function of the median value. So now anything up to 6 times the median value will be subject to a 1.5% tax rate, and anything above 6 times the median value will be subject to that 1.9% tax rate. Preliminary numbers suggest the median, or 6 times the median value, is going to be equal to approximately 2.274 million. So anything over or under, 2.274 million will be taxed at 1.5% rate, and then anything above that amount will be taxed at 1.9%. So essentially the threshold got bigger, but the rate also went up a little bit as well. So if we come back to that same graph for 2025, we'll start out by looking at what the taxable values would have been without this legislation. And we can see there's a straight line with a slope of 1.89%, regardless of the market value. Then with the passage of those two bills, again, that first $400,000 is going to be taxed at a lower rate, namely 1.4%. And then anything over that will be taxed at that higher 1.89% rate. So here you'll notice that those two lines are parallel. And that makes sense because the rate after $400,000 is equal to 1.89%, which is also the rate it was before this legislation. You'll also notice that because those two lines are parallel, the gap between them is the same regardless of market value. So that kind of makes sense, because if you think about $1 million property and a $2 million property, for example, both of them are benefiting equally because they're both only benefiting on that first $400,000. And lastly, unlike the residential property graph, those two lines do not cross. So all commercial properties will see a reduction in taxable value. And then in 2026, go to the next slide, Jason. It's a very similar story. Now the first 2.274 million will be subject to that 1.5% rate. So that's going to be a reduction. But you'll see that that reduction goes on for quite a bit longer than in 2025. And then after 2.274 million, that's when that higher 1.9% rate kicks in. And although 1.9% is slightly larger than what it would have been at 1.89%, it's only 1/100th of a percentage point difference. So those two lines essentially don't cross until very, very far out on the graph, and essentially really high market values. And then similar to the residential graph, we'll look at the effective rates for commercial properties. So there's that 1.89% that it would have been taxed at. And then in 2025, the first $400,000, we'll see that 1.4% rate. And then after that, the tax rate will increase, the average tax rate essentially. And that kind of makes sense as that first $400,000 becomes a smaller and smaller portion of the overall market value. Again, you'll notice that those two lines get closer and closer together, but they never cross, meaning that the taxable value is going to be reduced for all commercial properties. In tax year 2026, it is very similar. Although the first 2.274 million is now taxed at 1.5%, so it's an increase of a little bit there relative to 2025, but the threshold extends longer, and then after that 2.274 million, it starts to creep up again slowly. So those are the effective rates. Next, we'll look at some examples. This time we'll look at actually 4 examples. So the first property, again, $350,000. The second property, $750,000. The third is $2 million. And the fifth largest property is a $5 million property. So without Senate Bill 542 and House Bill 231, the taxable values would have simply been 1.89% of 1.89% of the overall market value of the property. So there are those amounts there. Starting in 2025, though, we're introducing those tiered rates. So if you look at the first property, all of that is going to be subject to that 1.4% rate. So the reduction in taxable value is going to be equal to $1,715 in percentage terms. That's a 26% reduction. If we look at the second property, that property will see a reduction in taxable value of $1,960. In percentage terms, that's going to be 13.83% of a reduction. And then if you compare that to the $2 million property, you'll notice that the reduction in taxable value is also equal to $1,960. And again, that makes sense because they're both only benefiting from that first $400,000 in market value being taxed at that lower rate. However, the second property, you'll notice, has a smaller percentage reduction because that first $400,000 makes up a smaller proportion of the overall market value. And then the $5 million property is kind of a similar story. If we look at tax year 2026, we can see that now the first 3 properties are entirely subject to that first 1.5% rate, that lower tier rate. So the reduction in value in percentage terms is all the same for those 3 properties. So that's that 20.63% amount relative to what it would have been otherwise. And then you'll see that that $5 million property sees a 9% reduction because, again, they're benefiting from more of their property being subject to that lower rate, even if that lower rate is slightly higher in 26 than it would have been in 2025. So that pretty much summarizes a lot of the changes to the tax rates that we wanted to go over with you, but we also wanted to talk about the rebate information, as in addition to changes to the tax rates, those 2 bills, Senate Bill 541, or excuse me, 542 and House Bill 231, also authorized a $400 rebate. So the application period for that rebate is going to open today, actually, and taxpayers will need to apply by October 1st of this year. That rebate, again, is for $400 for your principal residence. There's more information about the rebate at getmyrebate.mt.gov, so you can direct taxpayers there if they have questions. Information that a taxpayer will need in order to claim the rebate is their social security number, their current mailing address, and the geocode of their property, which can be found at cadastral.mt.gov. Is the main place we've been sending people to. There's also property.mt.gov, I believe, has a website that you can search for your geocode, as you will need that. It's also on your property tax bill if taxpayers have that handy. Taxpayers will also need the amount of taxes paid as reflected in the 2024 principal residence tax bill. Got to make sure that it's more than $400 essentially. We're going to mail rebate checks to taxpayers, and direct deposits will not be available. During the prior 2 rounds of rebates, we discovered that the direct deposit was a lot of potential for fraud there. So we're not going to allow that as an option this time. Additionally, a personal representative of the estate of a deceased taxpayer can also file the claim for the rebate on behalf of the qualifying deceased taxpayer. So that's something to be aware of. In order to qualify for the rebates, the types of properties that are eligible are single family homes, apartments, condominiums, trailers, manufactured homes, and mobile homes, including up to 1 acre of the surrounding land. So that's important for the types of properties that will qualify. But in addition, the taxpayer also needs to have owned the property for at least 7 months. You have to have lived in that property for at least 7 months in 2024. And then that property has to have been subject to property taxes, and those property taxes need to have been paid for that property. Grantors of revocable trusts are the only types of trusts that can also qualify. So irrevocable trusts do not qualify. And then in addition, properties that will not qualify for the rebate include entities such as LLCs or corporations. And then renters will also not qualify for the rebate as they do not own the property, which was a requirement in those pieces of legislation. Some of the things we wanted to share with you is we're hoping to have rebates issued within 30 days of a claim being filed online. We are going to make paper rebates available for taxpayers who are unable to file online. However, it's important to note that those will take up to 90 days to process. So it's a lot faster if taxpayers can apply online, and that's what we are encouraging them to do. You can always check the status and the amount of your rebate by visiting the Where's My Rebate on the Taxpayer Access portal or that getmyrebate.mt.gov website. It's also important to note if the taxpayer has an outstanding debt obligation with the state of Montana, the county, or university, that rebate will first be used to offset that obligation, and then any remaining amount will be refunded to the taxpayer after that initial obligation is paid. It's important to note that if the taxpayer moved in 2024, they can still claim the rebate if they owned and lived in a principal residence in Montana for at least 7 consecutive months during the year and paid property taxes on that residence. If that is the situation of a taxpayer, we are telling taxpayers to use the geocode for their most current principal residence. And it's also important to note that if a taxpayer is denied a rebate, they can file an appeal for that decision with form APLS 101F, which is available on the department's website, revenue.mt.gov. There's more information about that on the getmyrebate.com as well, I believe. As you mentioned a little bit earlier, those tiered rates for 2025 are going to apply to all residential properties, regardless of use. So they will apply to multifamily and single family homes, and there's no application needed because it applies universally. Similarly, there's no application needed for commercial properties because they are applied uniformly. So that's something for 2025. However, in 2026, it's a little bit different. Only owners of primary residence or long-term rentals will qualify for those tiered rates. So an owner is a primary residence if the ownership of the property is in their names or the name of a revocable trust. And again, you have to reside in that property for at least 7 months out of the year, and you have to be current on your property tax payments for that property. It can be a long-term rental if the property is rented and occupied by a tenant as their residence. It needs to be rented for a period of at least 28 days or more for a minimum of 7 months out of the year. And again, it needs to be current on the taxes billed. And just full disclosure for you guys, the department has devoted a lot of resources to implementing the tax year 2025 rates and getting those taxable values up. And we're just now starting to turn our attention to 2026. So a lot of the details are still being developed, and we look forward to having those out as soon as possible. So look forward to those. One of the other things you might notice is that the department doesn't have a great way of telling which properties are primary residence or which ones are long-term rentals, and by extension, which ones are not in those two categories. So we will need taxpayers to apply. One of the good things about the primary residence requirement, though, is if the taxpayer filed for a rebate and was approved in 2025 and you still own that property, then those properties are going to be automatically granted into that primary residence status and will be eligible for those graduated rates. If for some reason the owner of a property did not file a rebate, either because they simply chose not to or forgot, or they purchased their house or were ineligible for the rebate for some other reason, but would otherwise qualify for as a primary residence in tax year 2026, there is an application window for those folks, and that opens on December 1st of 2025, and those people will need to apply no later than March 1st of 2026 to get those preferential tax rates. Similarly, long-term rental owners will also need to apply starting December 1st, 2025, and they will need to have applied by March 1st of 2026 in order to get the preferential rates. So with that, that pretty much wraps up everything I had to say. We'll open it up for some questions if there are any. I'll be honest, I haven't really been watching the chat, so I don't know if there's any there. I think you're on mute there, Jason.
Yeah, I haven't been looking at the chat either. I was kind of running the show here. Let's see. Okay. A lot of instructions. What resources are available for people with disabilities who may not be able to access or use computers to look up information?
I do believe that the local offices are providing assistance to taxpayers that come in and ask for assistance. So I would direct them there. There's also the call center line is a wealth of information. 444-6900 is their number. We'll try and get people as much help as we can.
We also have a question from Boyd Jackson who says, how do we explain the calculation of the new property tax to the general public? We are not going to be able to take each taxpayer through all these math calculations.
Yeah. So property taxes have always been a bit difficult for taxpayers to understand, and this probably makes it more difficult. What I would say, if it was someone asking me that question, is essentially the tax rates are becoming more progressive than they once were. It was a flat rate, and now there is more of a graduated system similar to your income tax rates.
All right, good. And then Tyler asked a question. So a first-time home buyer who purchases a home after March 1st and would otherwise qualify for a preferential treatment in 2026 won't qualify because they bought their home on March 2nd? Question mark.
Oh, I don't know if Bryce is here. He might answer that better. I think they would still qualify because I believe the property is going it's going to be based on what the property was on January 1 of that year. So I believe if the property were to change hands, the taxes would be prorated. We'll try and get you a better, more definitive answer, as I'm kind of flying by the seat of my pants there.
Prorating anything if a property qualified for the homestead exemption and then sells, it remains on that property for the remainder of the year. So in that scenario, as long as the property they were purchasing was enrolled in the homestead reduced tax rate, it would stay on that property for that year, and then that new owner would need to apply to continue receiving it for the following year.
There you go. Thanks, Bryce.
The Department of Revenue applying a hybrid tax rate for properties?
Correct. So the tax rate will be different based on the market value of the property.
Thank you. All right. How do I apply for primary residence and long-term rentals?
Again, if the taxpayer files for a rebate and doesn't sell the property, then they will automatically be enrolled. But if they do sell the property, or for whatever other reason, as we just talked about, we're ineligible, there will be an application period starting December 1st of this current year, and taxpayers will need to apply by March 1st of 2026 in order to be eligible.
So Paula has asked, for 2026 year, it's stated the tax decrease would only go into effect if the property taxes were paid to current. Will the Department of Revenue keep track of who is delinquent and who is current?
Yeah, we're still working through the details on that. We will be doing some verification and probably asking for those lists of delinquencies from the counties to do some cross-reference and some compliance work. But we don't have the exact details worked out on that piece quite yet.
Awesome, thank you. And then what rate do subdivision lots that haven't sold yet fall under?
So that one gets a little tricky. So vacant land starting next year would not meet the definition of a primary residence. So it would get the 1.9% highest tax rate. There was another piece of legislation passed this session that deals with new subdivisions and puts a provision in place where that developer can prepay what the taxes on that land currently is for the next 5 years. And then those subdivision lots are exempt for the next 5 years or until they have a habitable dwelling built on them. So it's a little tricky with those because of that other piece of legislation that provides an exemption, a 5-year temporary exemption for new subdivisions. But in general, vacant land itself would be taxed at the highest 1.9% rate next year because it doesn't meet the definition of a primary residence unless it falls under this new exemption for subdivisions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, with that, folks, that wraps up all the chat. We got all those questions elevated and got those answered. Don't forget that you can get a hold of us through our call center at 444-6900, as well as you can find us on our website. This call was recorded. We'll clean it up and we'll get it posted, depending on how fast we can get those files back from Zoom. So be looking for that. We'll make sure that this will be available to you, as well as the presentation as well. Eric, thank you so much for hopping on here and giving this presentation. And thanks for being flexible in our presentation style today.
Thanks, Jason.
Bryce, thanks a lot for hopping in here. And we appreciate everybody hanging out with us. And we'll see you next time. Everybody have a nice weekend and take care. Thank you.